Hi, welcome to Beyond Politics. I'm Catherine Clark. The television show Perry Mason has probably been responsible for several law careers, but few as successful as that of my next guest. The Honourable Mr. Justice Michael Moldaver grew up in a blue-collar Peterborough family where common sense and respect for others was as valued as higher education. Mr. Justice Moldaver joins me now for a conversation about his childhood, his career, and life at the Supreme Court of Canada. Mr. Justice Michael Moldaver, welcome to Beyond Politics. It is really such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
At the formal ceremony that celebrated your ascension to the Supreme Court of Canada, you said something that really resonated with me. You were talking about the values that your late parents had instilled in you and in your brothers. You quoted humility and understanding of the human condition and an unfailing sense of humor. Can you tell me about those values and how they affected your upbringing and got you to this point in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was very fortunate, Catherine, to be raised in a household where it was just important always to try and do the right thing, and where moral values were instilled in you from an early age. I often laugh because if I ever got into trouble at school, I got into double trouble at home. And that's the kind of, you'll understand what I'm talking about. In fact, my mother was the president of the home and school when I went to Queen Mary's School in Peterborough. And I got into a scuffle with some guy in the yard at recess. And the vice principal brought me in and said, you have a choice. You can either get the strap here, or you can go home and tell your parents what you did. And I chose the latter. And the only reason I was able to do that, I'm sure, is because she was the president of the home and school, so I got kind of a break. But I paid the price at home, probably greater than what I would have paid had I got a few taps on my hand at the school. So we were raised in a household that it was important to have moral values, to be ethical, and basically my mother used to say, if it's worth doing right, and that's the way that stuck, or I've hoped to live my life in a way that way. But they were wonderful people too. I can talk more about my mom and dad, but they were community minded. They gave back so much to the Peterborough community, but they didn't have a formal education. They both had to leave school.
Why?
When they were young. My dad at about 14, my mom shortly after that, because back in those days they had to help their family make a living. And so there was no money to send for higher education and so on. And both Mom and Dad, if they had one thing that they were going to ensure was that their three sons, would get the education that they didn't have the opportunity to get. Now that said, they were both really smart people. In fact, I mean, I look at my dad, and despite having to leave school at age 14, he had more common sense and good judgment in his baby finger than I have in my whole body. And he had an understanding of people that was next to none. And so just watching him throughout life, and watching how he interrelated to people, and how he showed such respect for everybody that he came into contact with. And things that I found out later after he died, that he had been engaged in all sorts of charitable causes that no one knew about. I mean, and my mother was the same. I mean, she was involved not just in home and school, but VON, Children's Aid, you name it. And so I got a very good upbringing that way in terms of being community-minded and the importance of moral values and so on.
You also, they also emphasized hard work. I mean, your parents were hard workers. Your dad, tell me about your dad's business.
He was in the scrap metal business. which is kind of funny because there were many times actually throughout my career I wish I'd joined them. but just to show you the kind of sense of humor my dad had, when my brothers, Joel and Peter, we were all going to college, and so we were getting degrees, BAs, LLBs. My brother Peter got a PhD, and we would go home, and Dad would laugh about this and say that he had a couple of degrees too. He had his JD and his MD. And he would usually do this when there were other people around, and so people would say, "Well, what's that?" Oh, MD, metal dealer, JD, junk dealer. This is, I think perhaps he kind of wished that he'd had the opportunity to go higher in his education, but couldn't, so he made a joke out of it, but he was real smart. You didn't need to have formal education to be smart. He was real smart. So,
what do you think the conversation would have been like, or maybe you had this conversation, if you and your brothers had decided not to go on to university? Was that even an option?
It wasn't an option. It was not anything that was really ever discussed. The only time that I came close to leaving university is when my first year of law school, we wrote Christmas exams. Fortunately, it didn't count for anything, but I stood in the bottom quarter of the class and failed torts. And I came home. I remember coming home looking for a little bit of tender, loving care from my parents. And I went up to my father's office to tell him, in effect, that law school was not for me, and I was really seriously consider I would really like to join his business, And not only did I not get any tender, loving care, I got told that I wasn't working, and that I was getting on the next bus back to Toronto, and that he didn't want to hear from this ever again. Okay? And he literally drove me to the bus station and said, "Out." And I left back for Toronto.
Was that, was it because you respected him so much that you thought, okay, all right, he's right, I can do this, or were you just plain scared of him?
I was scared of him. I didn't want to ever cross my dad, but I mean, but I respected him too. And look, to a certain extent, I felt that it's important as a judge to try and know all the facts. He didn't think I was working hard. I was working hard. I was working very hard. I just didn't know how to write a law school exam. Some crazy part of me thought that they might want answers. They don't want answers on these exams. They just want to know if you know the issues. So I was trying to give them answers. They wanted issues, and I didn't do well in my first set of exams. But it wasn't because I wasn't working.
It's kind of ironic. Do they not have all sorts of prizes named after you now at the law school?
Well, I sort of, I donate a couple of prizes. Seemed like a lot of money at the time. It's nothing now, but
that's kind of fun, don't you think?
Yeah, that's kind of fun.
I think it's kind of neat.
Yeah.
Your dad must have just thought. Your dad would have thought that was great.
No, that was fun. I mean, well, the crazy part about it is that in third year, like, I was a very average student. I was a B student coming out of arts, and in those days, that got you into U of T law school. I mean, there wouldn't be a law school in the country that would even look at me today, leaving aside the fact that I'd never be able to pass the LSAT. We didn't have to do those, fortunately. But so I get into U of T law school with a B average, and I was a very average student in first and second year, and quite frankly, I think I was an average student in third year too. But by third year, I wasn't concerned that they were going to fail me, and I went into the exams and I relaxed a bit, and my marks went up. So and that ultimately sort of changed my whole life, because I was going to go back to Peterborough and practice with my brother. And because of my marks in third year, I was able to see if I could get a job with the late Arthur Martin, who was probably the Dean of Criminal Law in the whole country, and who later went to the Court of Appeal. And that's how life changed. I mean, it just overnight.
Why criminal law? What was the interest there?
Well, I liked criminal law in law school, but I also liked Perry Mason. We used to watch Perry Mason quite religiously when I was a kid, every week, standard fare. And the thoughts of being able to defend a person charged with murder who was innocent, and to have the real culprit confess after a blistering cross-examination was sort of too much for me to resist. So Perry had quite an influence on me.
When you actually got into a courtroom, did it live up to the Perry Mason experience?
No, I mean, things don't quite work that way in the courtroom. In fact, I often tell lawyers or students that one of the big problems with the courtroom is there's no certainty in the courtroom. You can prepare to the nth degree, you can do a sparkling job and still lose. So there's a lot of stress going to trial. And my motto sort of became, don't go to trial unless you absolutely have to. But if you go to trial, make your mark. So
how would you make your mark?
Well, you prepared to the nth degree, you were up on things, you knew the case backwards and forwards, you tried to do blistering cross-examinations and stuff, and there were good moments in the courtroom, and there were times that you just knew you had that jury with you, and they were behind you 1,000%. And then, of course, there were other times when I wanted to crawl into the nearest hole in the floor, because I'd been taken by somebody in cross-examination. But they're just, you really prepared, and you came into the courtroom, and you let the Crown know, and you let the judge know, and you let everybody there know that you were there to do a serious job, that it mattered to you. You talked about your dad and the fact that he had such common sense and an ability to relate to people. Yeah. And it seems that you chose a profession where those were important qualities for yourself too. I mean, you talked about how you can be completely prepared, yep, but that may not be exactly what you need. You probably needed common sense in the courtroom. And I'm sure a big part of the job also was reading people, understanding exactly how someone might react or how they might be feeling. Did that play into your job? Absolutely. I learned more about dealing with a jury and a jury trial, and I've said this before, from working on construction in the summers, road construction, than I did in all the years of law school. And by that, I mean, I got to know people, I got to meet people, I got to, there was an attitude against students like myself right off the top, from workers who were there for a lifetime, and I was just coming in as a summer student. So you had to get to understand people. You had to be able to kind of let them know that you're not some person who looks down on them, and that you respect them and you enjoy being with them, and so on and so forth. And as I say, I learned more about being able to talk to a jury from that than all the years of law school. And that's just as it keeps coming back to an understanding, or hopefully an understanding, of the human condition. I should just tell you that one of the reasons I went into criminal law as well was the fact that I did have the opportunity to article with Mr. Martin for 6 months. And it was during that 6-month period that I really decided that I'm not going back to Peterborough to practice with my brother. I'm going to stay in Toronto and try my hand at criminal law. And I got a very big break because I was able to get in to a law firm with Eddie Greenspan and Alan Gold and Mark Rosenberg later, who became a justice of the Court of Appeal. This was a tremendous opportunity. I was doing murder cases in my first year, which is virtually unheard of, but I was.
What, you talked about the fact that it was the opportunity to work with Mr. Martin for that 6-month period that really set you on the path to a career in criminal law. Was there something specific that happened then?
I had always liked criminal law in law school, and it just was just something that kind of overcame me, having had the opportunity to spend a few months with someone who was unquestionably the dean of criminal law in Canada. I don't think anybody has ever met or risen to his standards before. But I put that whole thing down to the unpredictability of life. I had planned, it was all set. I was going back to Peterborough. I was going to live a nice, quiet life, go home for lunch, and enjoy all the benefits of a small community. And that changed overnight. And one of the other things that just stands out for me, really stands out for me, Catherine, is that when I was with Mr. Martin, he had, as you may know, in the 60s, been involved in a reference to the Supreme Court of Canada in respect of Stephen Truscott. Stephen, as we all know, had been convicted of murder, had been sentenced to hang, but the sentence was commuted. And then a woman by the name of Isabelle Laborde wrote a book, and that got things stirred up. And long and short of it is, there was a reference to the Supreme Court of Canada, and Mr. Martin was acting for Stephen Truscott. And they had this reference, and Mr. Martin lost 8-1 in the decision, so the conviction was upheld. And while I was articling with Mr. Martin, on I think one occasion, and it was just a matter of like a 30-second conversation, I'm not even quite sure how it happened, he told me about the fact that he had acted for Stephen Truscott, because I hadn't been following the case at all. I hadn't read Mrs. Laborde's book or anything. And he told me how he'd acted for Stephen Truscott, how he'd worked so hard, how he'd filed a 300-page brief, and how he was disappointed in the result, and that was essentially it. Fast forward 35 years later, now I'm a member of the Court of Appeal. The Innocence Project had taken up Mr. Truscott's cause, and ultimately the Minister of Justice then, Mr. Cotler, the Honourable Irving Cotler, ordered an appeal back to the Ontario Court of Appeal, and lo and behold, I was one of the 5 judges that had an opportunity to sit on that and ultimately vindicate, or come as close as possible to vindicating Mr. Truscott. And I just thought, ain't life unpredictable? I mean, who would have thought that 35 years later, after I'm speaking briefly with Mr. Martin, and nothing to no extent, I mean, we didn't go into any detail, that somehow, and I thought to myself, Mr. Martin would have been real happy to know that one of his students perhaps had a hand in writing what we felt was quite a wrong.
Obviously that had an impact on you personally. Tell me on a professional sense what kind of an impact that had on you as well. Excuse me, because you were seeing a case where the justice system may well have failed. How did that impact you professionally in the way that you approach the job that you do?
Yeah. I guess I would have to say that even though a lot of people have criticized me about my comments about the Charter, I think I've been misunderstood, and the Charter is a magnificent document, and it's here to do great good, and it has done great good. And when you look at that trial back in the late 50s, the whole thing, I mean, from the time he was charged to the time he had leave refused initially in the Supreme Court of Canada was all of 6 months. And during that time, he was transferred to the adult court from the juvenile court. He had a trial, he had an appeal, and his leave was denied in the Supreme Court of Canada. That was all within 6 months. And I was thinking to myself, you know, this is an expeditious justice system, but it ain't justice. And so as I became involved in the Truscott decision, I saw some of the things firsthand that can lead to serious miscarriages of justice. One of them being the failure on the part of the police and the Crown to disclose. Now, I'm not faulting them. Things were different back in those days, but just how important a case like Stinchcombe is under the Charter that requires all relevant evidence to be disclosed to the defense. I was impressed by the fact that studies have shown how miscarriages of justice can result from tunnel vision on the part of the authorities. And in Mr. Truscott's case, the police sort of focused on Stephen Truscott from day one and really did not look beyond him. So there were a number of things that came out of that case, apart from just feeling that justice was finally done, that caused me to realize that we must take all reasonable steps to avoid the kinds of miscarriage of justice that, in my view, occurred in that case. And there are a number of factors that we look at today that weren't looked at back then.
Sure.
Yeah.
You were really a ferocious cross-examiner. You had a career which I have to imagine, as a criminal lawyer, was both interesting and lucrative. And then you were approached to join the bench. Why would you make that change? Did you ever consider not making the change?
There was something in the back of my mind that I always wanted to go to the bench for some reason. I probably went too young. I think it was only 42 or 43. I can't remember exactly.
Why do you think you were too young?
Well, it's a long haul. I mean, and I probably still had a few good years left as a defense lawyer, or, you know, as a lawyer. And so the late Eddie Goodman told me I was too young and that I shouldn't sort of go so early, but I didn't listen, and I did.
I think it worked out. Would you say?
Well, if I were to tell you, though, that after joining the bench, I got such a shock. I had no idea. I thought I was sort of going to be going into semi-retirement when I became a judge. And I remember...
You mean you thought the pace would slow down?
Oh, yeah, I thought I thought the workload would be less. I thought no more clients calling me at night and day, no more nasty judges, you know. I just thought this was going to be heaven.
You were going to be a nasty judge?
Well, no, I was hoping I wouldn't necessarily be a nasty judge, but I was hoping to avoid the nasty judges, and boy, did I get a wrong number. I never worked harder in my life than after becoming a trial judge. I had no idea the amount of work that went into it, and it literally consumed me. In the first about 2.5 or 3 years, I gained 45 pounds.
Really?
Yeah.
Just from the stress and the
having sitting. Yeah, the stress and the sitting and
wow.
Well, and I was smoking like a fiend. I was snacking a lot while I would sit and read and write. I was sitting and smoking and snacking, and sitting and smoking and snacking. And I wasn't snacking celery and carrots. I was snacking jubes and you know, chocolate-covered raisins and chips and everything, and I just ballooned. And it took a toll on me physically. It took a toll on me personally. It just...
so how did you turn it around?
Well...
did you think you'd made a wrong decision? Did you think this is the wrong choice?
I certainly thought that I didn't really understand what I was getting into, but then, of course, it was sort of too late.
Too late because you felt you couldn't resign? You couldn't
I didn't
be a judge?
Yeah,
it just
it wouldn't have been right to just sort of spend a couple of years and just walk away from it. I didn't think, you know. But it was very intense and very hard, and it really wasn't until I got to the Court of Appeal. And I actually had an incident, a little heart incident that kind of woke me up back in around 2001. And it was at that point that I sort of said, enough is enough. And I started to, you know, work out of bed, and I stopped smoking and went cold turkey and tried to get my life back in order a bit. Yeah, I went from a 36 to a 44 pant.
That's
virtually
really
overnight.
Incredible.
Yeah, well,
that's really incredible. Wow.
Yeah. So, but I think people don't realize this. I mean, I was a lawyer. I was with judges every day, and here I am going to the bench thinking that this is going to be like a semi-retirement.
Right.
You know, and I really think it's important. I mean, this is not whining, but I just think it's important that members of the public understand how hard judges really do work. This is not a cakewalk. I mean, look, there are some judges who do less than others, but on balance, these are hard-working people, and I defy anyone to sort of sit through and be a judge on a murder case that goes on for a month and a half, where you're trying to keep everything in order and you're making evidentiary rulings, and you know if you mess up on one of them that could be the end of it. The Court of Appeal may send it back, and then you come down to the crunch and you have to make a jury charge and keep on top of the evidence and keep things flowing in the courtroom and so on.
And know that you are dealing with people's lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mm-hmm. This is not a game.
Mm-hmm.
So I really do have enormous respect, particularly for trial judges who, as I said before, are in the trenches.
Yeah. When you arrived at the Supreme Court, was it that same period of adjustment for you?
I started to gain weight again.
Did you really?
Oh, I did.
Oh my gosh.
I did. When I was living at Minto Place for
yeah.
the first 6 months, I got back into the chips and the jubes and the chocolate-covered raisins, and I gained probably 20 pounds.
Thankfully, you had a lovely bright red robe to throw on over your...
Yeah, it hides a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, I started back into my old habits again, and then I just, after my wife moved to Ottawa and we got a house and everything, and tried to bring a little bit of balance back into things and watch the weight a bit and just bring some sense of normalcy back to my life. But yeah, it was, I saw myself going the same way after I came here.
You, prior to this interview, you and I had a conversation about the fact that you had a lot of fun, if that's the appropriate term to use, when you were on the lower courts, that you found that there was a very collegial atmosphere here. We also talked about the fact that the Supreme Court itself is a very imposing building. Right. There's a sense of grandeur when you walk in here and when you even walk down these halls. Are you able to have fun here, be a colleague, have regular conversations the way that the average Canadian does when they go to work every day? It's
not so regular as it was maybe in the Court of Appeal, but it happens, and I have wonderful colleagues, and some are perhaps a bit closer in the sense that I will socialize more with them than perhaps others. Not because I don't like the others, but it's just the way it is, you know. And so I think I would say there's good collegiality with everybody, and better with some, But that's normal, I think, So I have a number of colleagues here that I like to go out for dinner with, or have them out to our house, or I go to their house, and we have a nice night and let our hair down a little bit, and drink a little too much and tell a few war stories, and then get on with life the next day.
Is it isolating being here on the court, on the top court?
Isolating? It's an interesting question, because I think that in combination with being here, and obviously with less colleagues here, but also being in Ottawa, and I don't say that badly, but there seems to be, it's like, even though it's only a 4-hour drive to Toronto, it seems like it's an eternity. So sometimes I will get former colleagues coming to Ottawa, and whether they're here for a conference or just going through, and they'll come over and stay overnight and so on. But it doesn't happen very often. And I rarely ever get back to Toronto. And if I do, it's usually in and out, just for a dinner, and I'm back the same night kind of thing. So, and it's been harder, I must say, to try and make friends here, not because I'm not looking to, and my wife has been very good about sort of building up friendships with people who live in the Ottawa community, but I must confess that I've just, this job has pretty much been consuming, and most of my life is driving to the court, driving home.
You know what, given that schedule, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that you would take the time to do this interview. Oh. It's been an absolute delight to speak with you.
Well, my great pleasure. Thank you so very much. I've enjoyed it.